I'm going to do a row with both knit and purl stitches, and you can see what's going on when you switch between knit and purl stitches. So the working yarn's behind the knitting. I'm going to do a knit stitch up into the stitch, throw the yarn, as they call it, fetch it through. And now for English knitters, well, for either, we need to get this yarn to the front. And for English knitters, it looks like this. You manually bring it to the front before doing the purl stitch. So down into the stitch, counterclockwise wrap, pull it through and off. And now to go back to a knit stitch, you manually bring it to the back, go up into that stitch to knit, throw the yarn, fetch it through. So it's a back and forth motion, forward to do the purl stitch. Okay, and now for back to do the knit stitch, I'm going to switch to Continental, and you can see the difference here. You get to see the difference between, this is sort of the perk of Continental knitting. Watch this. So, oh, here's this funny twisted stitch. I'm actually going to knit. What you always want to do for knitting, I guess I'm backing up to address this, is you want to knit into the leading edge of the stitch, the first one you come to. In this case, it's in the back. So I'm going to go into that loop from the front of the knitting and grab the yarn and pull it through. And that creates a knit stitch that doesn't twist this stitch in any way. So we did knit one, and now watch what it looks like to jump from this knit stitch orientation with the yarn in the back to the purl stitch orientation with the yarn in the front. For Continental knitting, it looks like this, where you just hop over the needle. And in fact, as you, well, you'll see, it's not even a separate step. As you're doing the stitches, it can be done sort of in tandem. So with the knitting, with the working yarn in front, I'm just going to make sure I go behind that working yarn and down into the stitch on the left needle to do the purl stitch. And again, however you can do it, pop it through. You want the leading or the right hand edge to be on the right side of the stitch for a standard stitch orientation. So, oh, you see I did it automatically. The yarn is automatically in the back. So here's the knit stitch with the yarn in the back. And then as I hop off, I'm just bringing it to the front to do the purl stitch. And then bring it off into the back to do the knit stitch. So there's no separate step of bringing the yarn forward or back with Continental knitting and purling. So here I've done, here's what a row of alternate knit and purls looks like. You see the knit stitches on the needle, the stitch that's on the needle, if that's the head, like a person's head, if you think of that loop as a person's head, kind of looks, the stitch we just knitted looks like they're wearing a scarf or a shawl over their shoulders from the front. And that's a knit stitch. And then the purl stitch looks like the back of their head wearing that scarf. And that's exactly what it is. It's the back of, I'm going to turn this one over. We'll look at it from the front. Same stitch. Looks like the front, the knit stitch on the other side. Or the bumpy purl stitch on this side. It's the same stitch, it's just reversed. And if I continued to do knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, purling into these back of the scarf purl stitches and knitting into the front of the scarf knit stitches, Then we'll have a column of knit and a column of purl. Ribbing is usually done over an even number of stitches, what I'm doing now. Knit 1, purl 1, or knit 2, purl 2, where you stack these columns. It doesn't have to be, but it's easier to remember where you're at. So that's the beginning of ribbing. If I stagger them every other row, it's called seed stitch. And it looks like this. So this is my knit, this is my purl column, knit, purl. So for seed stitch, instead of knitting the knit column, I'll purl it on the next row. Or I could slip it, whatever. Just because it's the first stitch. Knit 1, or purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl into those front of the scarf knit stitches, knit into the back of the scarf stitches. But you see how that's got kind of a neat bumpy, scattered bump effect. Whereas this has a column of a vertical element, that ribbing. So those are a couple stitch patterns. The most common stitch pattern most knitters begin with when they're doing their first scarf is just knitting every row, no purl stitches at all. And that produces what's called garter stitch. And I'll show you that. It's the easiest way to get a fabric that lays flat, I guess I'll just say. Makes for a good scarf. And it's easy to do. I do encourage playing around with the purl stitch as soon as you're comfortable doing so, just because it may determine which knitting method you choose to rely on as your main method, whether you're English or Continental. I'm covering both in this video intentionally so that you can be oriented and decide, you know, as soon as you like which to do. And it's also good to practice both, I'll say right away, because at least with the knit stitch, a lot of people will ultimately employ both techniques, the holding in the right hand or the left hand the yarn. Continental or English style knitting can be employed at the same time when you're working with 2 strands of yarn, doing color work, and that's an exciting topic. And that's, you can learn about how to do color work in our advanced techniques section of Knitting Help. Okay, here's garter stitch. It's got a horizontal element to the knitting. It's got ridges, like we just did a knit row. So we've got those scarves hanging over the shoulders, but then on the back, we've got these ridges, the back of the scarf. Because we're turning the work every row, we're getting them on both sides, and it creates these ridges on both sides. That's garter stitch. And you're all probably wondering how to make that sort of familiar common knit fabric called stockinette stitch. And here's what we're doing now to do that. I just knitted a row. My last row was knitted for garter stitch. And now I'm purling a row. Purl, purl, purl the whole row across. And now I'm going to knit a row. Knit, knit, knit. I'm alternating a knit row and a purl row. A knit row and a purl row. And that's going to give me stockinette stitch or stocking stitch. I'll show you what that looks like. And here's that very familiar, it looks like all of the front of the scarf hanging on the person's shoulders, or V's, on top of V's, next to V's. It looks like that on one side, and then on the back, it looks like all ridges or back of the head of wearing the scarf. So it looks like purl stitches on one side, and this is indeed the row we will purl when we're making stockinette fabric. We will, when this side is facing us, we will purl all of these stitches that are purling, that look like recently purled stitches. And when we're on the front of the work, we will knit all of those stitches facing us looking like knit stitches. So that is, I think, it's a lot of information, but it's the basics for any beginner knitter. How to cast on, as we did, long tail cast on to begin. How to keep your edges neat, and how to do the knit stitch and the purl stitch in both Continental and English styles. So the last couple tips I want to mention are when we're knitting along, say you're knitting your project, you're in the middle of a row and you have to stop for some reason and put down your knitting. I just want you to notice that the yarn right now, I just knit the stitch, is connected and attached more clearly to the right needle. If you tug on it, you can see it's tightening the loop on this right needle. So just notice that, because when you go to put down your knitting and you go to pick it up again, you might accidentally pick it up and go, okay, which side, where was I? Was I knitting this way or that way? Which hand do I hold the yarn in? So if you pick it up the wrong way, like this, and the yarn is attached in the left needle, and you grab that to begin knitting, you'll be knitting in the opposite direction you just came from. I'll do it to show you. And then if you continue on, you'll have a nice hole where there's that gap. So sometimes knitters go, how did I get this hole in my knitting? That's how. So don't do that. So when you stop your work and you drop it and you pick it up, just remember, look which needle is the yarn attached to, and put that in your right hand to begin your work. Actually, I'm going to back these up. And what the heck, I'll show you. I'm going to take my knitting off the needles, because I know that's the biggest fear of a lot of you. What do I do? Ready? So I'm going to slide these mistaken stitches right off. Unravel. Boop, 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 boop. All the way. Okay, I'll just do all of these. Basically, I'm unraveling it until it's attached and can't unravel anymore. And then I know where I'm at. I've got the yarn is attached to this needle, and this is going to be the needle in my right hand when I start knitting again. But let's get these loops back on this needle. I just come in from the back of the loop and poke it through each loop. And if the yarn is very twisty and wants to be coming and you want to come in from the front to make it easier, you can. Just remember to knit that leading edge of the stitch when you continue. Okay, so I've got the yarn attached to my right needle, and I'll just finish this row.